In the waning days of 1865, Alabama's frost clung to the earth like a final act of defiance, as if the land itself refused to release the chains of a dying era. The war was crumbling, its echoes faint but undeniable. Yet the Tisdale plantation stood unmoved, a fortress of cruelty where time seemed to kneel before the whip. Smoke curled from the manor's chimneys, a grey testament to the illusion of permanence. The cotton fields, scarred by endless labor, stretched under a sky that whispered of change, whispers the overseers refused to hear. Their whips cracked with the same venom as always, as if they could lash freedom itself back into the shadows. But freedom is not a gift to be given, it's a fire to be seized. And in one man's silence that fire was already burning. Welcome to the forgotten cell, where the untold rise from the ashes. Among the enslaved was Samuel, a man whose broad shoulders carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. His silence was a fortress, unyielding, mistaken by the cruel for surrender. They called him mute, mocked the stillness that cloaked his pain, never suspecting it was a blade being sharpened. Samuel had lost everything to the plantation's hunger, a wife broken under the whip's relentless song, her last breath stolen as he watched, helpless. A son torn from his arms in the dead of night, sold to a fate shrouded in darkness. He did not scream when these wounds were carved into his soul. He did not beg or break. Instead, he buried his grief deep, where it smoldered like a coal waiting for kindling. In his silence, Samuel was writing a reckoning. The overseers, blind to the storm brewing in his quiet, struck him harder for his lack of cries, their laughter as brittle as the ice on the fields. But Samuel saw everything. His eyes, slow and deliberate, traced their every move, the way they gripped their whips, the slurs they spat, the cracks in their confidence as the war's end loomed. Whispers of freedom snaked through the quarters, fragile as candlelight. Some clung to hope, daring to believe in Lincoln's distant promises. Others saw it as a trap, a cruel jest to deepen their despair. For Samuel, hope was a dangerous spark, one he kept buried as carefully as the graves he dug for those who fell. But oh, how close that spark was to igniting. The overseers felt the shift, though they'd never admit it. Their boasts grew louder, their whiskey stronger, their eyes restless, scanning the horizon for a threat they couldn't name. They spoke of Washington, of proclamations, of a world slipping from their grasp. Their cruelty sharpened, laced with fear, as if they could outrun fate by tightening their grip. Samuel watched it all, his hands steady as he worked the fields, his head bowed as if deaf to their panic. But inside he was counting, every glance, every curse, every crack in their armor. He wasn't just enduring, he was building. As winter tightened its hold, the plantation buzzed with a tension that hummed beneath the frost. The fields lay barren, but something else was growing, something wild, unseen, inevitable. In the smokehouse, under the flicker of a dying lantern, the overseers gathered, their voices jagged with liquor and spite. They spoke of defiance, of a world they'd refused to let go. They tossed dice, scratched names on slivers of wood, each mark a life they planned to snuff out before freedom could claim it. They called it cleaning, as if their hands weren't already stained with blood. Miriam, the washerwoman, her hands trembling from old wounds, was named first. Then the boy who ran too fast unless fear froze him. They bartered lives like coins, laughing as they divided the night's work. But they didn't see the shadow listening. They didn't feel the weight of Samuel's gaze. Samuel moved like a ghost along the edges of their words, carrying kindling as if it were his only purpose. He heard it all, the dice's roll, the names they chose, the order of their cruelty. He memorized their plans, their paths, their pride. In the quarters, hidden behind loosened boards, he kept a secret. A strip of cloth, a stub of charcoal, a fragment of a hymn. There he marked the days, the punishments, the names, etching them into the wood like a vow. That night he added 5 strokes, tall, unyielding, each one a promise. The wood would remember, even if the world forgot. The overseers' voices grew bolder as the bottle emptied. They swore no law would touch Tisdale, no proclamation would break their dominion. They'd do their work in the dark, they said, and by dawn the yard would be silent, hope crushed under their boots. But Samuel knew their rhythm. The moment Redden's pipe would fade, the limp that slowed Hobbs' step, the bravado that made the youngest careless. He knew the paths they'd take, the doors they'd forget to lock. Their game was set, but Samuel was playing one of his own. Before the night deepened, he walked the plantation's edges, where the earth held secrets no whip could pry loose. He pressed his palm to the ground, reading its truths. The soft soil near the quarters, the stubborn roots by the pecan tree, the places where a man might stumble, where a rope might catch. No one saw him measure the darkness. No one heard the vow he whispered to the wind. The night was his, and it was listening. As the lantern in the smokehouse flickered out, the overseers scattered, their plans sealed, their laughter fading into the cold. Samuel stood in the doorway of the quarters, his silence a sentinel, his heart a furnace. 5 marks burned in the wood, 5 names carried on whiskey-soaked breath, 5 lives the night now owed him. Beyond the fields, the old world trembled, sensing a shift it couldn't name. The plantation held its breath, as if the air itself knew what was coming. And Samuel. He was ready to break the silence with a vengeance that would echo through time. His work began before dusk, unseen, folded into the hours no one questioned. He told the quartermaster he was digging pits for charcoal, a lie so ordinary it passed like dust in the wind. But Samuel wasn't digging to preserve. He was preparing. The forgotten cell brings you stories of those who refuse to be erased, and Samuel's tale is only beginning. The earth near the quarters was soft, yielding under Samuel's touch, its dampness a quiet ally that held secrets without protest. He learned its texture by feel, how it crumbled when shallow, how it sighed when deep enough to cradle a truth no one would dare unearth. He walked the land like a cartographer of pain, mapping 5 plots with the precision of his forearm and the rhythm of his stride. Each was placed where shadows gathered naturally, where footsteps faltered in the dark. He smoothed their edges to mimic the carelessness of untouched ground, scattering brittle leaves to cloak the fresh scars of his shovel. Inside each pit he laid strips of burlap, torn from discarded feed sacks, not for comfort but to hush the fall. A body wrapped in burlap meets the earth in silence, and silence was Samuel's only offering. The ground would keep his vow, even if the world forgot. His tools were gathered with the patience of a man who knew the cost of being seen. A coil of rope, salvaged from a broken well line, coiled like a promise in his hands. A stake, whittled from a splintered punishment board, its edge honed by time. Rusted nails dulled to mercy. A smear of lard to quiet a creaking hinge. A scrap of cloth to bind a mouth without tearing flesh. Nothing sacred, nothing grand. Just the ordinary scraps of a plantation's endless decay, invisible in their absence, excused by the land's hunger for repair. Samuel didn't need miracles. He needed the world to look away. At night, when the wind whispered through the slats, he returned to his hidden ledger. Behind the loosened boards, 5 marks stood like sentinels etched in charcoal. Beside each he scratched a name, not the overseer's titles, but the wounds they'd carved into the lives of others. Miriam's name burned next to 2, her trembling hands a testament to their cruelty. The boy who ran too fast marked another. His wife's final breath, a ragged thread stolen by the whip, lived in a smudged streak where Samuel's hand had faltered once, then never again. Each mark was a prayer, each name a verdict. He studied the overseer's habits like a man reading scripture. The youngest swagger dissolved into a drunken stumble by dawn. Hobbs' limp dragged a half-step behind the rest. Redden's pipe flickered out as he turned toward the sheds in the 2nd hour past midnight. Their routines were as predictable as the seasons, built brick by brick through years of cruelty. Samuel didn't need to lure them. They'd already paved their own paths to ruin. He tested the hinges of the quarter's doors, now slick with lard, opening without a whisper. He sprinkled salt on a patch of earth to harden it, forcing a boot to slip where he needed hesitation. A length of twine tied low across a post waited for a careless stride to falter. Nothing looked like a trap to sober eyes, but under the haze of whiskey, every step would lead to fate. The night was his canvas, and he painted with shadows. Rumors drifted from the distant road, snatches of talk about proclamations, armies, a church bell ringing in a town too far for hope to reach. The quarters absorbed these sounds, holding them close, saying nothing. Samuel didn't pray for strength. He drew it from memory, the rip of cloth as a body was bound to the whipping post, the echo of a final cry in the yard, the sky's cruel indifference. These steadied his hands more than any hymn. He didn't need God's blessing. He had the weight of his own heart. On the eve when whispers promised a new dawn, Samuel knelt by each pit, pressing his palm to the cool, obedient earth. He counted backward from 5, each number fading into breath. His plan demanded no speeches, no flames, no rebellion's roar, only patience, precision, and the overseer's unshakable arrogance. He rose, brushed the soil from his knees, and stepped into the quiet of the quarters, where dreams were hushed by fear. Behind him the pits waited, silent as sealed lips. Before him, the night unrolled like a judgment already written. The winter hadn't ended. It had learned to bury its own. Morning broke, grey and reluctant, as if the sky itself feared what it would reveal. The overseers were gone. Their absence hung in the air, spoken in cautious murmurs, as if naming it might summon their return. The quarters held their breath, braced for the whip's crack that never came. The yard, once alive with barked commands, lay eerily still. Chickens scratched near the sheds, unhurried. Dogs wandered without masters, confused by a silence heavier than any storm. The plantation's master spun a tale of desertion, blaming the war's chaos and the lure of whiskey. He shouted it to anyone who'd listen, as if volume could make it true. The enslaved kept their eyes low, their glances fleeting, their silence a shield hiding what they knew. Samuel worked as he always had, his movements steady, his gaze averted. But inside a weight had lifted, replaced by something vast and unshakable. The ledger's 5 marks were crossed, blackened with finality, and the earth had kept its promise. Seasons turned and freedom arrived, not with trumpets, but with a weary rider carrying papers no one in the quarters could read. The words passed from mouth to mouth, fraying with each retelling, but their truth held firm. No more chains, no more masters. The plantation crumbled into memory, its fences rotting, its fields reclaimed by weeds. Families left carrying bundles lighter than their grief. Some sought towns, others followed roads north, and some stayed, bound to the soil that had both broken and birthed them. Samuel stayed, not for the road, not for the city, but for the graves he'd tended. He wasn't running from the past. He was its keeper. Years passed, and Alabama cloaked itself in progress, its voice drowning out the whispers of those buried beneath it. But near Tisdale's ruins, stories lingered. Children dared each other to pass the old quarters at dusk, swearing they heard cries from the earth. Farmers spoke of plows catching on bones, of burlap tangled in roots. No map marked the place, no record named the missing men, but the ground held its secrets like scars. Historians, years later, sifted through faded ledgers, finding Samuel's name, a freedman who stayed, who tilled a small plot until his quiet death, buried in a pauper's grave with no marker. The overseers' names vanished, their wages unpaid, their fates dismissed as desertion. But the soil knew more than the scholars ever would. In a summer drought, when the earth split open, bones surfaced, 5 skeletons wrapped in burlap, jaws locked in silent screams, ribs caved inward. No names marked them, no prayers blessed them. The discovery was buried in whispers, too heavy to speak aloud, for to name it was to admit the land itself had judged. Villagers said the air near the quarters never warmed, not even in July. The pecan tree leaned low, its roots twisting toward the unmarked graves. Nightbirds shunned the ruins circling wide, and the wind carried murmurs too faint to decipher, but too heavy to ignore. The fields remembered what the world tried to forget. Samuel's story lived in 2 truths. The ledgers called him a man who lived simply, died alone, left nothing behind. The whispers told of a shadow who carried grief like a blade, who turned the earth into a witness. Neither erased the other. They wound together, inseparable like roots and soil. Those who saw him in his later years spoke of a face neither bitter nor at peace, but carved with a patience that outlasted questions. When asked about the overseers, he'd tilt his head, silent, his stillness more unsettling than any answer. His eyes held the weight of a man who'd already settled his debts. Decades later, a preacher passing through recorded a story no congregation wanted to hear. An old woman who'd known Samuel as a child claimed he hadn't acted in rage. He'd waited, measured each moment, struck when the overseer's pride blinded them. One by one he bound them, speaking their crimes softly, as if the earth needed to hear their sins before claiming them. "God lowered them alive," she said, and as the soil filled their mouths, Samuel prayed not for mercy, but for the ground to remember. The preacher dismissed it as madness, yet admitted the air near Tisdale felt heavy, the earth hollow underfoot. He stopped writing, unable to bear the story's weight. But the land carried it still, Samuel's grave bore no stone, his name no sermons, yet his shadow stretched longer than any monument. Travellers swore they felt watched at the quarter's edge, not with anger, but with a quiet demand for reverence. Some saw a figure at dusk, broad-shouldered, head-bowed, hands gripping an unseen shovel. The pecan tree's roots grew thicker, curling toward the 5 mounds. The fields whispered of dice, of muffled screams, of a night when silence became justice. The forgotten cell tells the stories the world tried to bury, and Samuel's is one that will never fade. His silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a world being remade,